Hospitals are full of secrets. I've been a doctor long enough to know the strange stories shared in hushed voices at the nurse's station, or over a quick cup of coffee during the night shift, but I never thought I would become part of one. It was an ordinary night on the medical ward, where I was working the night shift. Things were quiet with only a few patients in intensive care. I had experienced many long nights, and when it was quiet, I usually appreciated it. I went to visit one of my patients, Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who had been in a coma for almost 2 weeks. He was stable, but hope for recovery was slim. It was one of those cases where the family had already said their goodbyes, and the nursing staff had prepared for the inevitable. I had checked his vitals earlier in the evening, and everything had been uneventful. Yet, something gnawed at me, a feeling that this night was different. As I approached his room, I noticed something strange. The low hum of the monitors filled the air, but the usual sounds of routine had a peculiar undertone, almost like a whisper, a low murmur coming from the hallway. I slowed my pace, straining my ears to catch a single word, but it disappeared instantly when I stopped. I chalked it up to my imagination and continued to Mr. Peterson's room, mentally going through his chart to maintain my focus. I opened the door quietly and stepped in. To my surprise, Mr. Peterson was awake. He lay there blinking at the ceiling. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, which had been dull and glassy from the long coma, now seemed to hold a spark, a hint of consciousness. For someone who had lain in a coma for so long, it was startling to see him awake. "Mr. Peterson," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He slowly turned his head toward me, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if he recognized me. Then, as if clarity washed over him, he nodded with the slightest movement. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She is leaving us tonight." "Who is leaving us, Mr. Peterson?" He looked past me, his eyes fixing on something over my shoulder. I suppressed the urge to turn around. A shiver ran down my spine. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, as if he were telling me a quiet secret. "She is waiting," he murmured, letting his gaze wander back to the ceiling. I didn't know how to react. I had seen cases where patients experienced confusion or hallucinations after waking from a coma. But this was different. His tone, his certainty. It felt more like he was stating a fact than drifting through a delusion. I tried to compose myself and made a quick note in his chart, but I couldn't get his words out of my head. "She is leaving us tonight." I checked his vitals and administered his medication, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. As I turned to leave, Mr. Peterson whispered again, his voice as soft as a breeze. "She is here." I spun around to face him. His eyes were wide open, staring at the door. I followed his gaze, expecting to see someone standing there, but the door frame was empty. "Who is here, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. He didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the door. I stepped closer, hoping to snap him out of this state, but his expression didn't change. He stared into the empty hallway, as if someone or something was standing right there, just beyond the threshold. An uneasy feeling spread in my stomach, and I stepped out of the room, casting one last look at him before closing the door. His words echoed in my mind as I walked down the hall. At the nurse's station, I met Linda, the head nurse, who was preparing charts for the next shift. I tried to shake off the tension, but the urge to share what I had just experienced was too strong. "Linda," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you know anything about Mr. Peterson? Was he ever clearly conscious?" She looked at me, her brow furrowing. "No, he hasn't been responsive since his admission." "Why?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound too dramatic. "And was just awake, and he said something strange." Her expression changed, a spark of curiosity mixed with unease. "Strange?" "Yes, he told me that someone would leave us tonight, And then he said, "She is here." He kept looking at the door, as if he saw someone standing there. Linda's face went a bit pale, and she looked down the hall toward Mr. Peterson's room. "You aren't the first to mention this," she said. I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "There are rumors among the night shift. Sometimes patients who are close to the end say similar things. It's as if they sense something we can't. They say they see someone waiting for them." A shiver ran down my back. I had heard stories about patients having visions, but I had always dismissed them as hallucinations or medication side effects. But there was a weight to her words, a seriousness that made it hard to simply dismiss. "Has anyone else on this ward spoken of this recently?" Linda looked down the hall again, her expression inscrutable. "Room 7. The woman there died last night. She told one of the nurses that someone had visited her, but when they checked, the hallway was empty." A chill ran through my body. I hadn't been on duty last night, but the thought that another patient had seen the same thing triggered a wave of unease in me. Could it really just be a coincidence? I tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling and made my rounds to check on the other patients. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed an empty room or a shadowy corner, I felt an invisible presence, as if someone lingered just out of my sight. When I returned to the nurse's station, I heard a faint beeping from one of the monitors in the hall. I looked at my watch. It was 3:15 a.m. Most of the staff had gone home. Only a skeleton crew remained to tend the ward. The hallway stretched out quiet and dimly lit before me, every footstep echoing in the void. I made my way back to Mr. Peterson's room to check on him one more time. He had been in a coma for weeks, and after his sudden words about leaving us tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was happening here. When I entered the room, an unexpected sight met me. Peterson was awake, not groggy or confused, but sitting completely upright with a clear look in his eyes. The first time since he had been admitted, a nurse was at his bedside, quietly arranging his pillows and checking the IV. He looked over at me and gave me a faint smile. "Mr. Peterson, you are awake." I stammered, trying my best to hide my shock. He looked perfectly relaxed, as if he had just woken from a refreshing nap, not a long coma. "Awake, and feeling quite well, Doc," he said, laughing. "The nurses here know how to take care of someone properly." I looked at the nurse, who nodded, confirming that everything had been checked and adjusted to keep him comfortable. To her, it was routine, but for me, this whole situation felt anything but routine. "How do you feel, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, still surprised by his rapid recovery. "Honestly, I feel like I've slept forever," he replied, "but everything feels normal. It's like I just woke up." He paused, looked me in the face, and added, "Something wrong?" It took a moment before I could answer. "No, everything is fine. I'm just glad you are awake." "But do you remember anything from earlier tonight?" Mr. Peterson frowned. "Tonight? I don't remember anything." "Why?" I hesitated and continued. "You told me that someone would leave us tonight. Does that sound familiar?" He shook his head, looking genuinely confused. "No, I don't remember anything like that." I told myself it was possible he was drifting in and out of consciousness and perhaps murmuring things that made no sense to him now. But the sound of his voice, so clear and certain, played over and over in my head. The rest of the night passed without incident, and after a few hours, I went back to my rounds. When I passed Peterson's room again, he was sleeping as peacefully as someone can who has been unconscious for weeks. Around 5:00 a.m., I was paged by one of the nurses from the ICU. A patient had passed away in the early morning hours, a woman in her late 40s who had battled a series of complex health issues for months. As I read through the notes on her chart, my gaze fell to the hallway, and I looked toward Mr. Peterson's room. just one door away from the deceased woman's room. It hit me like a blow. She is leaving us tonight. Had Mr. Peterson somehow sensed what would happen in the room next to his? After her death, a strange calm lay over the hallway, a feeling that lingered even as the hospital woke up with the morning routine of doctors, nurses, and patients. It was a heavy silence, one I couldn't properly explain, as if in the quiet hours of the night, something important had happened, something that went beyond what the mind could fully comprehend. I never spoke about the incident with Mr. Peterson again, and neither did he. When he was discharged a few days later, he seemed as clear and alert as ever, with no further mention of his strange experiences. But to this day, every time I pass that room, I remember that night and the words he said before he fully awoke. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something deeper? Something none of us could ever fully understand. I will probably never know for sure, but a part of me wonders if Mr. Peterson, in the spaces between consciousness and the unknown, saw something I couldn't see, something waiting right behind the door, hidden in the silent hours of the night. Next true horror story. Hospitals have a way of playing tricks on you at night. The sterile, humming environments are unsettling enough on their own, but when darkness falls, it transforms into something completely different. A quiet, echoing expanse that feels far too empty and unnerving. I had been admitted for a minor surgery, nothing life-threatening, but they wanted to keep me for observation for a few days, which was supposed to be routine. My room was at the end of a long hallway, away from the busier areas and far from the nurses' station. At first, it felt peaceful, but as the hours passed, that solitude began to feel like abandonment. It was on the second night that the unease really started to creep in. I had been drifting in and out of a sluggish, semi-awake state, where sounds seemed louder than they should be and shadows darker. I heard footsteps in the hallway, which isn't unusual in a hospital at night. But somehow there was something strange about them. They were slow, shuffling, with long pauses between each step. I thought it was a nurse, perhaps checking on patients with that quiet kind of care shown during night rounds so as not to disturb anyone. I turned over in bed, trying to ignore the sounds and go back to sleep. But I couldn't. The footsteps stopped right outside my door and paused for a moment. I expected to hear a gentle knock or the soft creak of the door opening. But there was nothing, only silence. The longer I listened, the eerier it became. The presence outside my door didn't move, made no sound. I looked at the clock, 3:07 a.m. I began to tell myself that I was imagining it all, that it was just my overactive mind. But then I saw it. A shadow stretching across the small sliver of light shining under the door. It was no trick of the light. This shadow was clear, distinct, with a shape that looked human. But it didn't move like a human's shadow. It just stayed there, motionless, as if someone was standing right outside my door watching me. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing, but I clung to rational explanations. Maybe it was a nurse taking a call. Maybe she had stepped away from my door for a moment. But as I stared, the shadow didn't budge an inch. I tried to hear even the slightest sound, but there was nothing to be heard. After a few moments, the shadow retreated, as if melting back into the darkness. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been a product of my imagination. Hospitals and medications can play tricks on you, I thought, as the nurse came to check my vitals. I mentioned it casually, almost laughing, but the nurse didn't seem amused. "Oh, you saw a shadow in the hallway?" she asked with a tense voice. "Maybe just one of the night nurses on rounds," she replied, her words sounding rehearsed, forced, leaving a strange feeling in my stomach. I tried to shake it off and spent the rest of the day in a distracted haze, unable to fully relax. That evening, as the lights were dimmed, the tension returned. I watched the hallway with tired eyes, dreading the thought of seeing that shadow again. It was midnight, and for a while, everything was quiet. But at 3:02 a.m., I woke up again to the same shuffling footsteps. I lay still, my whole body tensing as I listened. The footsteps stopped outside my door again, and I braced myself, knowing exactly what I would see. Sure enough, the shadow appeared again, but this time it seemed to press against the gap under the door. The air felt thick. I stared at the shadow, unable to look away, wondering who or what was standing out there, and why it wouldn't come in or move away. Suddenly, the shadow shifted, as if changing its position. Then, just as quickly, it melted back into the darkness, leaving the hallway silent again. The next morning, I noticed the patient on the other side of the hall, an older man named Mr. Wills, speaking to a nurse. I couldn't hear most of their conversation, but one phrase caught my attention and made my heart skip a beat. The shadow in the hallway. He had seen it too. I knew it wasn't my imagination. There was something real lurking in the hallway at night, something that only showed itself in the dead hours, when everyone else was asleep. A cold feeling washed over me as I looked at my door again, dreading the thought of another night in this room. When the nurse came to check on me, I mentioned what Mr. Wills had said, hoping she could give me a rational explanation. But her expression changed, and she quickly wiped it away, saying, "Mr. Wills is on strong medication and often hallucinates." But the way she avoided my gaze made me believe there was more to it, that there was something she didn't want to talk about. That night, I tried to stay awake, determined to catch the shadow if it returned. I left my bedside lamp on, hoping it would be enough to keep whatever it was away. Hours passed, and eventually, I fell asleep, my exhaustion overpowering my fear. But at exactly 3:00 a.m., I woke up again. The room was silent, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, as if I were being watched. I turned my head toward the door, my heart pounding, and there it was again. The shadow, darker and clearer than ever before, pressed against the narrow gap of my door, which was slightly ajar. It seemed like it was trying to enter. I couldn't take my eyes off it, staring with morbid fascination as it moved slowly, gliding down the hallway, only to stop at Mr. Wills' door. The shadow lingered there for a long time, and then, to my horror, passed through his closed door and disappeared into his room. I lay there, too terrified to move, listening for any sound from across the hall, but there was nothing, only a suffocating silence that seemed to choke me. I barely slept the rest of the night, my mind racing with fear and questions. In the morning, I learned that Mr. Wills had passed away during the night. The nurses said he had died peacefully in his sleep, that it was simply his time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had something to do with it. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was no coincidence. Later that day, I heard two nurses speaking in hushed tones outside my room. "It's always at 3:00 a.m., whispered one of them, "and always the patients at the end of the hall. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural." When I heard that, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just a trick of the light or side effects of medication. There was something in the hospital, something that only came out in the dead hours of the night, and I was the next target. That night, I lay awake, my body tense with fear. I knew it would come for me just as it had come for Mr. Wills. I stared at the clock, my heart beating faster as it approached 3:00 a.m. I wanted to flee, run from this room, and never look back, but I was too scared to move. When the clock struck, the shadow appeared again, darker and clearer than ever before. It crept across the hallway, sneaking toward my door, and I knew there was no escape. I held my breath as the shadow pressed against the narrow gap of my door, as if testing the barrier to find a way in. I could feel its presence, cold, filling the room with a sense of dread, so strong it seemed to choke me. The shadow lingered outside my door for hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving only silence behind. The next morning, I was discharged from the hospital. I left as quickly as possible, glad to be free of that place. But even now, I can't free myself from the memory of that shadow lurking in the hallway, waiting. And sometimes, I wonder if it is still there, waiting for its next victim. Next true horror story. I have been working as a night nurse for years. You see a lot, get used to a lot, and eventually, you get used to getting used to everything, if that makes sense. But every now and then, something happens that you just can't get out of your head. I am not a superstitious person, or at least I wasn't before this happened. But there is one night I just can't shake off. Even now, it feels like it happened yesterday. It was a quiet night shift. An elderly man, Mr. Connor, lay in room 216. He had been admitted after a severe stroke, and when he arrived at the hospital, he was already in a coma. The doctors were quite direct. He would likely never wake up again. Honestly, he was just there, breathing on his own, but barely. Many would have said he existed, but didn't live. On most nights, I went into his room to check his vitals, check the drip, and maybe adjust the blanket. He was a familiar part of my shift. I had gotten used to the steady, quiet sound of his breathing, the calm rhythm that became part of my own routine. But something was odd about him, or perhaps about his room. I can't say exactly what it was, but it was a strange feeling I had every time I was there. It is hard to explain, but sometimes it felt as if there was a weight in the air, a heaviness that crushed me as soon as I entered the room. One night, it must have been around 200 a.m., I was making my rounds as usual. The hallway was empty and dead silent, and I remember it being colder than usual. Hospitals are always cold, but that night it was icy. I was wrapped in my sweater, but it seemed to make no difference. I remember my hands actually trembling from cold sweat as I approached room 216. When I stepped into Mr. Connor's room, the cold hit me even harder. It was like walking into a freezer. I shivered, pulled my sweater tighter, and told myself it was just the air conditioning. I tried to concentrate on my work, checking his vitals and looking at the monitors, but I couldn't ignore this prickling feeling on the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you just know someone is watching you. That's exactly how it felt. I tried to shake it off, didn't want to start imagining things on my shift. I leaned over Mr. Connor to check his drip, and that's when I noticed it. His breathing was so light, so faint, that I had to lean closer to make sure I was seeing it right. And then, suddenly, he moved. I swear my heart almost stopped. One moment he lay there completely still, and the next he was sitting upright in bed, staring directly at me. It wasn't a slow rise as if he were stirring. It was as if he had come alive in an instant. His eyes were wide open, fixing me with a rigid stare. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. I felt like I was staring at a ghost. And then he spoke. "He is coming for me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. The words hung heavy and cold in the air. I tried to ask him what he meant, who he meant, but before I could say a word, his eyes closed, and he fell back into the bed, exactly as before. Again, he was gone. His breathing returned to the slow, shallow rhythm, as if he hadn't moved. I stood there petrified, trying to comprehend what I had just seen. My mind raced, and I felt waves of fear and confusion wash over me. Reflex, I told myself. It must have been a reflex. Maybe a last burst of energy. They say that can happen sometimes. But I couldn't shake his words, couldn't get his voice out of my head. "He is coming for me." The way he said it. As if he were certain. As if he had been waiting for this moment. I left the room, feeling this tightness in my chest, and went back to the nurse's station. hoping the other nurses wouldn't notice how shaken I was. But I must have looked quite pale, because one of them asked me if everything was okay. I nodded and tried to play it down, said it was just the cold, that I was tired. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back to check on him. I told myself I was exaggerating, that it was just a weird moment I simply had to get over. But when I opened the door to his room, his bed was empty. My first thought was that maybe they had moved him for a late examination, even though I knew that made no sense. I checked the blanket. It was still warm, as if he had just been there. I ran back to the nurse's station, trying to stay calm as I asked, "Did anyone move Mr. Connor?" They looked at me confused. "Moved? What are you talking about?" one of them asked, and I saw the confusion in their eyes. "Mr. Connor is gone," I said, trying to remain calm, even though I felt a surge of panic inside. Everyone stared at me as if I were crazy. We checked the entire hallway, searched every room, even the supply closets and stairwells, but he was nowhere. It was as if he had simply dissolved into thin air. The more we searched, the more I began to feel that same cold feeling again, a cold that went down to my bones. I still heard his words in my head, "He is coming for me." Finally, one of the nurses suggested checking the security footage. We all gathered around the monitor, our gazes tense as the security guard rewound the footage from that night. And then we saw it. There lay Mr. Connor, exactly as I had left him. And then a figure appeared at the door. A tall man dressed in dark clothing slipped into the room, so smoothly as if he were gliding. He went to the bed, hesitated not a second, bent down, and lifted Mr. Connor out of bed, placing him carefully into a wheelchair he had brought along. There was something uncanny about his movements, as if he were too practiced, too calm. We watched as he wheeled Mr. Connor out of the room, down the empty hall, and out of sight. No human noticed it. He passed not a single orderly and triggered no alarm. It was as if he knew exactly what he was doing, as if he had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The police were called immediately. They questioned us all, trying to figure out how someone could just walk in and take a patient without anyone noticing. But none of us had answers. The footage showed everything, but there was no clue as to what happened after leaving the building. For days, there was no news, no trace of Mr. Connor or the man who had taken him. The police kept searching, kept calling us with questions, but it was as if they had vanished into thin air. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, couldn't get those words out of my head. "He is coming for me." It was as if he had known the whole time. Finally, about a week later, the police found them. They had found the man from the footage and identified him as Mr. Connor's son. It turned out that Mr. Connor had made his son promise years ago not to let him die in the hospital. I guess he had been afraid of hospitals all his life, like those people who always say they are places where people die. It was a promise he had made, and his son had come to keep it. They found them in an old farmhouse a few towns away. Mr. Connor was weak, barely able to sit up, but he had refused to return to the hospital. He died 2 weeks later with his son by his side, exactly as he had wanted. As tragic as the story was, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in that hospital bed, looking directly at me, and saying, "He is coming for me." It felt as if he had known it the whole time. Next true horror story. Night shifts as security in a hospital are already uncomfortable enough. When strange events are added to the mix, it gets really intense. I had taken the job because I thought it would be easy, secure the hallways, do a few rounds per shift, and generally ensure no one unauthorized enters the hospital. But the reality turned out to be something different than I expected. At night, A hospital has an eerie quality, and intense silence hangs in the air. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the constant hum of the air conditioning or the clicking of the lights in the stairwell were normal. After all, every building this old has its quirks. I was paid to keep watch and ignore these small disturbances. Until one particularly strange shift near the morgue. I never liked being near the morgue, to be honest. I had tried to avoid it as much as possible. But on this Wednesday night, I was assigned to the basement level, which meant I had to scan the area every hour, check the locks, check the doors and windows, and ensure everything was secured. The hospital was emptier than usual that night, with only a few patients and even fewer visitors. Just a few staff members strolled through the halls on various floors to finish their shifts. Around 11:00 p.m., the basement was unusually cold. Hospitals are always cold, but this night had a different feel. An icy chill that made you feel like you were walking straight into a freezer. Then I noticed a slight flickering of the light at the end of the hall leading to the morgue. I figured it was probably just a defective bulb and didn't pay it much attention. Still, I added it to my list of things to report. As I approached the morgue, the light flickered again, this time pulsating, as if synchronized with my footsteps. I forced myself to stay calm and suppress the unsettling feeling. Flickering lights happen. The morgue is just a room, I thought, while my mind tried to settle down and make everything seem normal. I was just doing my job. But then, as I passed the main door, I thought I heard something. A soft, indistinct sound that I couldn't quite place. It was almost as if someone was whispering. I stopped and listened, but all I heard was the hum of the ventilation systems. I continued walking, telling myself I just needed to stay calm. But then, as I took a few steps further, I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a voice whispering deep and faint, "Derek." I froze. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just the wind drafting through the ventilation system, or a distant echo of a conversation from another floor. But it hadn't sounded like that. It sounded personal. Someone had said my name. I shook my head, tried to dismiss it. The hospital was, after all, just a big empty building at night. It's easy to imagine things. But the voice came again, and this time it was so clear, so unmistakable, that I couldn't ignore it. "Derek." I took a deep breath and talked to myself. I was the security guard. I had to check, make sure no one was breaking the rules, that no one was unauthorized or doing anything they shouldn't. Slowly, I walked to the morgue door and opened it a bit further. The light inside was dimmed but enough to see that the room was indeed empty. Yet as I turned to leave, the voice came again. Louder. Closer. "Derek. Please." My breath caught in my throat. This time it was unmistakable. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was calling my name, pleading. Against every instinct screaming at me to walk away, I went further into the room, scanning the shadows. My heart raced as I searched every corner, every surface. Nothing was out of place. The tables were empty, the drawers closed, and the silence was as thick as the walls around me. But while I stood there, I heard something else. A quiet, rhythmic tapping. The sound was low but echoed through the room, steady and constant. Almost like fingers tapping against the metal tables. I aimed my flashlight at the source of the sound, my hands trembling as I gripped it tight, waiting to see something. Anything. But again, there was nothing. Then, just as I turned to leave, I felt something cold. An intense chill pressing against the back of my neck. It was as if someone had blown an icy breath onto my skin. I whirled around, my flashlight frantically scanning the room, but again, nothing. I was alone. Or at least I should have been. As I stood there, trying to calm my breathing, the tapping started again, this time from the other side of the room. My heart raced. Every fiber of my body screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear myself from the spot. It felt as if something was holding me, as if I were meant to hear, to understand. The room fell into complete silence again. I was already tense, and this silence made everything even more intense. I turned to leave when I heard a soft shuffling somewhere down the hall, getting louder, as if someone was slowly walking down the corridor. My first thought was to dismiss it as a janitor or another night shift worker. But something about these footsteps felt wrong. They were slow, almost hesitant, but steady. Every step came closer to the morgue, echoing off the tiled walls, so I couldn't tell where they were coming from. Then I realized the footsteps were coming directly toward me. I tried to listen, hoping they might turn and go another direction, but they kept getting closer. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped back to the door, and quickly seized the handle. The footsteps were only a few feet away, right outside the door. I turned the handle just as I yanked the door open and ran quickly into the hallway. In the hall, I didn't look back. I kept running until I reached the main corridor area, where I heard the familiar sounds of the hospital again and calmed my breathing. That night, I realized there is more in the silence of the hospital than I ever imagined. And whatever was in the morgue, I didn't want to find out. When I finally calmed down, I tried to rationally explain what I had seen and heard. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stress of the night shift had taken its toll. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I hadn't just imagined the voice. Something or someone had been in that morgue with me, calling for help, desperate, trapped. After that night, I avoided the morgue as best I could and asked for shifts that kept me away from the basement. But every now and then, I heard stories from other guards. Stories of whispers, strange noises, lights flickering at unusual times. And every time, I felt that familiar chill, the memory of the voice calling my name. The last time I was assigned to the basement, I did my rounds quickly, kept my head down, my steps light, didn't dare to linger. I don't know what was in the morgue that night. Maybe it was a lost soul, a ghost caught between worlds looking for someone to hear its call. Or maybe it was just the building, the echo of life and death, that had passed through its walls, and still hoped someone would remember. All I know is that since that night, I haven't set foot in that morgue. And every time I pass by, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching, waiting, and hoping for another chance to whisper my name. Next true horror story. I was a nurse for over 40 years. I spent the majority of my career in hospitals, working in the ER for the first few years, and later moving to the intensive care unit, EICU. I have seen many terrible things and developed a strong stomach for all kinds of things. There are 1,000 stories I could tell, but one is the worst I have ever experienced. It happened during my first year in the ICU, and I still have no explanation for it. Before the man came under my care, he showed up in the ER with strange symptoms: delirium, vomiting, and what looked like first-degree burns all over his body. At first, they thought it was caused by a chemical substance, which led them to believe they needed to clean his skin and detoxify his body. But when they tried to wash his skin, it simply fell off. What looked like first-degree burns was actually just the tip of the iceberg, a mountain of complete tissue destruction. At that point, the ER team didn't know what they were dealing with. This was decades ago, long before the internet existed. The man refused to answer questions, and he had no identification on him whatsoever. It was as if he had simply been dropped off there. Eventually, the doctors figured out that the man was suffering from acute radiation sickness. But the dose he had received and the severity of his case were still unknown. All we knew was that it was bad and he probably wouldn't survive. He was transferred to the ICU, and that's where I met him. I knew it wouldn't be long before it would be impossible to get any information out of him, even if he wanted to tell us something. So, every time I did something for him, be it changing his IV or measuring his vitals, I bombarded him with questions. I asked for his name, if he had family, how he was exposed to the radiation, and if he knew how much he had taken. But he barely answered my questions. The only thing he really ever said to me, and apparently the only thing he ever said to anyone, was, "I wish they had just shot me." It was as if the words had just slipped out. Despite his best attempt to hide them, he immediately looked as if he regretted saying anything at all. I kept asking who they were, but after that one sentence, he sealed his lips. Days passed, and his condition deteriorated. His skin began to take on a rainbow of colors as it gradually withered and liquefied, oozing through all the bandages we had applied and detaching from his body at the slightest touch. I thought he would scream in pain, but most of his nerve endings had already turned to mush. The damage was everywhere on his body, but it concentrated on his hands and feet and crept up his arms and legs, while his vital organs were affected last. It was almost as if it was done intentionally and cruelly to ensure he was alive and conscious, while his body slowly perished. We would have never found out who he was, or how he suffered radiation poisoning, if his family hadn't coincidentally shown up on the third day. They had driven from hospital to hospital asking about a man who had disappeared 3 days prior. They described the man very precisely, and it was clear that the man they were looking for was the one decaying slowly in the ICU. Nowadays, we might have had to deny them access to see him due to IPA regulations, but back then it was different. Everyone in the hospital wanted this poor man to experience something good before he died, so we let his family see him. But they couldn't look at him without breaking into hysterical tears. After the encounter, we asked the family for more information, and then we finally learned who he was. The man worked for the government as a nuclear waste disposal specialist. He was one of the men who buried barrels of radioactive waste and had compiled a long list of complaints about the lack of safety regulations. Unfortunately, he was exposed by some government agents who, according to the family, had set a fire in his office to destroy all his work. It was the same day he disappeared. What I found out, and what he told me, was that they had forced him to clean up a deadly toxin accident and told him to keep his mouth shut unless he wanted his family to suffer the same fate. That explained why he wouldn't tell us anything, but so many things still didn't make sense. In the end, however, it didn't matter. He was terminally ill, but his family wanted us to give him every chance to come out alive. We all knew that wasn't possible and would only prolong his suffering, but I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. Slowly, the flesh melted off his arms and legs, exposing his bones, forcing us to amputate. I assisted the surgeon at the time, and I will never forget how his bones became soft, almost like rubber. After that, he was just a torso and a head, but the horror spread further as the decay reached his face. His skin melted over his eyes, blinding him. He nearly choked on the fluid from his own dissolving tongue. His gums receded so his teeth fell out. He could still breathe, but he had to gurgle through the slime to get a breath. Burns are often considered one of the worst types of damage to the human body, but this level of radiation damage is somehow even worse. He was rotting like a corpse, but he was still alive, breathing. I can't imagine the mental pain he must have gone through the whole time, trapped in a body that turned into a grotesque, monstrous thing and slowly fell apart. Eventually, he could neither see nor hear. But He knew he had become a hideous, monstrous thing, that this was the last image his loved ones would have of him. I only hope he didn't feel any of it, but I will never know. Finally, after weeks of horror, his family agreed to stop trying to keep him alive. Only then could he finally die. Since then, I have nightmares about it. I think it was the slow process of becoming an abomination of existence that bothered me the most. Of all the ways to die, that must have been the worst. Next true horror story. I am a registered nurse in a small to medium-sized rural ER and have been working in this profession for about 4 years. One of the biggest challenges we face is the prevalence of substance abuse and mental illness. I live in a medium-sized town, neither too big nor too small, surrounded by farmland and small towns. Due to the size of my town, we deal with many substance abuse cases, primarily methamphetamine-induced. This is the moment where I want to make my public service announcement. For the love of God, do not do methamphetamines under any circumstances. It will absolutely destroy your life. One thing people don't realize is that drug use can lead to mental illness. It's often a chicken and egg scenario whether the mental illness came first or if the drugs caused it. One night, a local EMS team was called to treat a patient with drug-induced psychosis. The patient was brought to our psychiatric area, accompanied by EMS and local police officers. The moment I saw him, I could immediately tell he was in full psychosis. He was in his mid-40s to mid-50s, unkempt with gray hair, unshaven, and in ragged, dirty clothes. He looked like the classic depiction of a crazy homeless man from a movie. He was extremely paranoid and verbally hostile, convinced that we wanted to harm him. We tried to de-escalate the situation without restraining him, but it became clear that wouldn't work. I spoke with the doctor, and we agreed to give him an injection of an antipsychotic. I prepared the syringe and went back to the psychiatric area. When I entered the room, several people were already inside, some from our ER staff, hospital security, and at least 3 or 4 police officers. The patient had calmed down somewhat since I last saw him, but he still needed the injection to fully relax. As I approached him with the syringe, he became paranoid again. After I calmed him down once more, I prepared to administer the injection into his right shoulder. I lifted his shirt sleeve, cleaned the injection site, and grasped the muscle while he spoke to one of the officers. I counted to 3 as usual and inserted the needle into his shoulder. Now, a quick note on my technique. I hold the syringe like a dart when I insert it. After the needle is in, I change my grip and hold it between my index and middle fingers like a cigarette so my thumb is free to push the plunger. Unfortunately, as I changed my grip, the patient panicked. He looked at the syringe in his arm and pulled back in terror. The syringe remained stuck in his arm as he moved. And then he pulled it out with his left hand and lunged at me, holding the needle like a weapon. The officer immediately sprang into action, and one of them yelled, "Needle," to warn everyone in the room. The patient's momentum carried him in my direction, and, although I tried to get out of the way, I felt an impact on my left thigh. The syringe and needle fell to the floor, and I saw that the needle was bent. By then, everyone had pounced on the patient to restrain him, while he screamed loudly. I quickly grabbed the needle and syringe to clear them out of the way, while trying to process what had just happened. I began to panic. Had the needle hit me? The thought of the diseases this man potentially had terrified me. I ran to the bathroom to check my leg, and to my great relief, I found that there was no injury. The only thing I can imagine is that the needle hit a pack of gum I had in my pocket at the time. If Wrigley ever needs a spokesperson, I am available. After the situation was under control, A police officer asked if I wanted to press charges against the patient. At first, I said no, because I felt sorry for him. He was obviously mentally ill and not fully in control of his actions. But as the shift went on, my feelings changed. Why should I let him get away with attacking me just because of meth use? Why should I endure the fear and discomfort associated with this incident for the rest of my career? Finally, I called the officer back and decided to press charges. But 2 years later, nothing has happened because the patient was deemed mentally incompetent. Once again, I beg everyone, do not do methamphetamines. They destroy lives. Next true horror story. I am a relatively new paramedic and have been working in this profession for a little over a year. One of my most memorable calls was for a man who had died. The call came in as an unresponsive male, possibly dead on arrival, DOA. When we arrived, we found the scene eerily quiet. The man's wife stood in the doorway, obviously shaken, but not hysterical. She led us into their small bedroom, where the patient lay flat on his back on the bed. The man looked as if he had been dead for a while. His skin was ashen, his mouth hung open, and the unmistakable smell of decomposition filled the room. I remember it was one of those cases where the scene didn't feel right from the start. The hair on my arms stood up almost immediately. I glanced at my partner, and he had the same expression on his face, as if we both sensed something was wrong. We went to the patient to check for signs of life, although it was pretty clear the man had been dead for a while. I went to feel for a pulse while my partner readied the defibrillator, just in case. As I touched his wrist, the wife asked if we could revive him, but my partner gently explained that it was too late. There was no rigor mortis yet, but it felt as if he had been dead for a few hours. As I leaned in to check the airway for potential obstructions, I noticed something strange. There was a slight flutter in his chest, a faint movement under the skin. I thought maybe I imagined it, or it was just a post-mortem muscle twitch, which isn't unusual. My partner noticed it too, but we both shrugged and brushed it aside. We followed the usual protocols, confirmed the patient's death, and reported it. The wife, still standing in the doorway, seemed to accept the situation calmly, which in itself was unusual. Usually, there are more emotional outbursts, but she just stood there staring at the body. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave the room, the atmosphere became unbearably heavy. I don't know how to describe it, but the air felt thick, as if it were crushing us. Just as we were about to open the door, we heard a loud gasp from the patient. Startled, we turned around only to see his chest slowly rising and falling. First slowly, then faster, as if he were struggling to breathe. My partner and I froze, unsure of what was happening. It was impossible for him to be alive after the state he was in. We ran immediately back to the bed, checked the pulse, and this time we found one. His heart had started beating again out of nowhere. We rushed to put the oxygen mask on him, our hands shaking with shock and confusion. We began resuscitation and tried to stabilize him for transport. The wife just stood there, completely unfazed, as if she had expected this to happen. We managed to get him onto the stretcher and into the ambulance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening. As we drove at high speed toward the hospital, the patient's condition began to deteriorate again. His pulse became weaker, and his breathing increasingly labored. My partner tried everything to keep him stable, but it was in vain. On the way to the ER, his heartbeat flatlined. As soon as we arrived at the hospital, the doctors confirmed that he was truly dead this time. They couldn't explain how he had come back to life for those few minutes. The strangest part was when we drove back to the house to fill out the necessary paperwork. The woman had disappeared. Later, We found out that the man had been dead for almost 6 hours before we arrived, and it was impossible for him to have returned even briefly. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that call. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I still get goosebumps when I think about it. Next true horror story. I have been working for about 6 years in a general hospital. For privacy reasons, I won't name the hospital, but it all took place in a great neighborhood of Philadelphia. Those who live in Philly or have been there probably know what I'm talking about: drugs, high crime, and the constant sound of sirens. Several times a week, the hospital even had to involve the police due to gun violence occurring in the area. I am 35 years old, and although my work is fulfilling, it can also be very stressful and often leave me drained. I work as a security guard at the hospital, and my job often takes me to the psychiatric ward. My shifts are constantly irregular, but the pay is good enough to keep a roof over my head. Due to the hospital's location, our security contract is often exploited, so we have to take on tasks that technically shouldn't be in our scope. One night, I received a call from the ICU about a patient who had recently passed away. I was responsible for bagging the body. The deceased was an older man, probably in his mid-60s. I didn't ask what he died of since that wasn't part of my job. I put on my gloves, prepared the body, and placed it in the body bag. Just before I zipped it up, I paused and stared at him. For some reason, I felt strange and uneasy. I had dealt with many bodies, but this case made me deeply unsettled. After bagging the body, I took it as prescribed to the morgue and placed it in the freezer to wait for the funeral home. Hospital regulations require us to stay in the morgue until the body is picked up. It's a rule I don't necessarily find necessary, but I follow it nonetheless. When the funeral home arrived, I led them to the freezer, where we handed over the body. It sounds simple, but it requires careful handling to ensure safety. As I pulled the body out of the freezer, things immediately got weird. The funeral home employees claimed I had the wrong body. I was confused. There were only 2 bodies in the freezer: the one I had just pulled out and a 16-year-old girl who had been hit by a train. It was impossible that I had confused them. After some back and forth, the funeral home employees determined that I did have the right body. One of them looked at the tag, clearly identifying the man. Yet when they opened the body bag, they recoiled. The man I had placed in the morgue was now contorted. His right arm was behind his back, he lay on his right side, and his left arm was stretched forward. His mouth hung unnaturally open, and his eyes were wide. My mind raced. How could that be? I had put him in the bag with his arms at his sides. No one but me had access to the freezer. I was the only guard with a key. There was no possibility that anyone else had touched him. And I would never be so disrespectful or unprofessional to handle a corpse like that. The funeral director began to accuse me and ask how I could have left the body in such a state. I stood there silently as they zipped the bag back up and left. I was reprimanded by my supervisor for allegedly tampering with the body. Even though I explained that I had done nothing of the sort, he didn't want to hear any of it. To this day, this incident haunts me. It is simply impossible to know what actually happened, and I haven't been able to process the event until now. Next true horror story. In 2007, I was working part-time as an aide in a hospital in downtown Chicago. I was 19 years old and helped patients with proper care, including eating, drinking, and general check-ups. Sometimes I had to deal with strange and angry patients who felt entitled to special treatment. This was more common with older patients, and although it bothered me, I tried to understand their situation. Most days, I was constantly on the go with food and drinks, and had only an hour break. One day, my supervisor informed me about a new patient who had just been admitted. She was an elderly woman, probably in her mid-70s, and obsessed with her daughter Sarah. She spoke about Sarah every day and told how sweet she was. Unfortunately, Sarah had passed away years ago, and the woman had never overcome her grief. We sympathized with her and listened to her to support her. Eventually, she was transferred to the ICU as her condition worsened, and after a few weeks, she passed away. My colleagues and I were sad about her death and mourned for about a week before returning to our normal work rhythm. A month later, while I was sweeping the floors, I saw what looked like a little girl at the end of the hallway. She wore a pink skirt and a white top. I was confused because there were no children on this floor, and visiting hours were long over. The girl just stood there staring at me. As I approached her, she ran into a nearby room. I couldn't let a child run into a patient's room, so I followed her. When I entered the room, I found it empty. Only a hospital bed and a TV were inside. I called for the girl, but received no answer. With a queasy feeling, I searched the bathroom and even under the bed, but found no one. I reported the incident to my colleagues and informed them about a child running around on the floor, asking them to keep their eyes open. But despite multiple people looking for her, no one could find the girl. The creepiest part was when I checked the security footage. It showed me trying to get the girl's attention, but the girl wasn't visible on the footage at all. I panicked and informed my supervisor, but he dismissed it as a joke. No matter how often I denied it, he refused to believe me. To this day, I am convinced that the girl I saw was the woman's daughter, Sarah. I like to think she appeared to thank me for taking care of her mother. A colleague believed me because he had also seen the girl a few weeks prior. He told me he was in the basement gathering medical supplies when he saw a girl in a pink skirt running around, which scared him. He didn't report it because he thought people would think he was crazy. Since then, I haven't seen Sarah again, but I have noticed smaller things disappearing from patient rooms. Pillows, candy wrappers, and even water bottles. It could have been another employee, but I have always wondered if it was her. Next true horror story. Now, for about 3 years in R&N at the General Hospital, and it is one of the toughest but also most rewarding jobs I've ever had. Since most of the time you help people in severe health conditions. Mostly you take care of patients and administer their medications. There have been several nights where people came into the ER complaining about fibromyalgia and other common conditions that can easily be treated at home. Often, I treated these patients by giving them simple over-the-counter medications, provided they had insurance. Yet there were also moments when I had to treat patients who really needed help. Treating these patients not only satisfied me, but often you also developed an emotional bond with them. This story follows this principle. Once, I took care of an elderly woman whose husband had just passed away and who had been hospitalized for a severe bacterial infection. Her name was Kate, and she was the loveliest woman you can imagine. She always told us stories about the animals she used to own. She loved animals and used them as a coping mechanism. Unfortunately, the hospital didn't allow pets except for service dogs, which made her very sad. I felt terribly sorry for her, because despite everything she was going through, she was always kind to us. In the last week, I developed an emotional connection to her. I made sure to pay her special attention because I really cared for her. It was heartwarming, but as a nurse, it is my responsibility to be there for my patients. One day, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and thanked me for everything I had done for her. Her words shocked me and left me astonished because I realized what she meant. She died the next day, and I cried for almost a week. The other nurses were sad, but not as much as I was, since I was one of the people she really cared about. Weeks passed, and eventually, I came to terms with her death. She popped up in my thoughts now and then, but as a nurse, you are constantly busy and have to keep moving forward. One night, I was speaking with a colleague at the front desk about a patient's billing when she asked me to get a device from the basement. The basement is where we usually keep our equipment and other medical supplies. It is not common in most hospitals, but we have one here. It is rare for one of us to go into the basement, so I knew we needed something important. I took the elevator down and switched on the light. As soon as I stepped out, I had an uncanny feeling. I had been in the basement many times, but I had never felt anything like this. It felt as if a feeling of fear was coming from some direction, but I couldn't say from where. To be fair, basements in hospitals are creepy, so I ignored the feeling and walked down the hall. I grabbed the item from one of the shelves when I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. They didn't sound like someone wearing shoes, but rather barefoot. I thought it was one of my colleagues trying to scare me. Instead of getting annoyed, I decided to catch him in the act. I walked out of the room and back into the main area, but I saw no one. Eventually I called out, "Hello, is anyone else here?" As expected, I received no answer, which only made me walk faster. I wondered if the noises came from the electrical panels. I hurried to the elevator, and as I was almost there, I heard it quite clearly. The voice of an old woman calling my name down the hall, "Sarah." It took only a second for me to realize that it sounded exactly like Kate. I was officially scared and hurried back to my station. I didn't tell anyone about it, because I thought they would think I was crazy. The only person I confided in was a nurse I trusted very much. Based on my expression when I told her, I think she believed me because she seemed to understand. Nonetheless, that was the last time I went into the basement. Now, whenever someone asks me to go down there, I always find a way to get someone else to do it. Every time someone else goes down there, I get looks, but honestly, I don't care. I have never believed in the paranormal, but I have no explanation for what happened that night. Next true horror story. I was barely old enough to understand how close I was to death because of the illness I had, not to mention that I had an inkling of what would happen to me during the treatment. My mother took me to the hospital and told the doctors they should do everything to save my life. They needed a lumbar puncture before they could proceed with the treatment. The look on my mother's face when she heard that told me everything I needed to know, even though I had no clue what a lumbar puncture was. I remember my mother begging the doctors to find some way to make the procedure less traumatic for me, but for some reason, they couldn't put me under general anesthesia. Instead, they offered me a new experimental treatment, which at the time was intravenously administered ketamine. My mother had never heard of this drug, and my father wasn't there. They explained that it was traditionally used as a horse tranquilizer, but had recently been approved for use in humans, even in pediatric care. My mother swears that was all they told her about it. Maybe it was a critical case, or maybe the doctors thought they shouldn't tell me everything about the drug's influence, because otherwise she would have refused it, which in their opinion would have made the lumbar puncture even more difficult. Honestly, I never thought doctors would consider giving a child ketamine, but that is exactly what happened. They took me into the operating room and explained what would happen. I would have to lie on my side, and they would stick a needle in my back. They said it would be extremely uncomfortable. Now I know that they said that, but at the time I was so disoriented, scared, and confused that it all sounded like gibberish. like the sound of adults in Charlie Brown when they just say, wah wah wah, if you know what I mean. All the doctors and nurses wore masks and gowns, which made them appear almost ominous. I had to undress and put on a hospital gown, which added to the stress because I had to expose myself in front of a group of strangers. The only thing that somehow kept me sane was that my mother was allowed to be with me so I could hold her hand. Before they began the lumbar puncture, they inserted the IV needle to administer the ketamine. I cried and screamed. I remember squirming just because that needle was stuck in my arm, and I didn't yet understand how much bigger the next needle would be. Then they turned me on my side, and I held my mother's hand, squeezed it tighter than before, looked into her eyes, cried, and tried to be brave and sit still. At first, I only felt the cold hospital air on my back. But then something happened. Everything began to feel strange. Of course, now I know that was the ketamine starting to take effect, but at the time I didn't understand that. An overwhelming feeling of fear came over my body, and I also felt like I was losing control over it, as if my soul was slipping away piece by piece. Then it literally felt like I was dying and ascending to heaven. I was lifted from the table and could see my own body and everyone around me. What I saw filled me with a mixture of fear and hatred. The doctor aligned the needle on my back, and for the first time, I saw how huge the thing was. There was my mother, watching the whole thing and letting it happen. Suddenly I knew I couldn't go through with it anymore. I screamed, kicked, and thrashed around to get off that table and run away. The nurses tried to restrain me, but they struggled to control me. Someone called for help, and then two huge, muscular nurses stormed in, grabbed me, and pinned me to the table, along with 4 or 5 other people. My mother cried in the corner. Apparently, I had punched her in the face. But I could still see everything around me, and the IV was still dripping ketamine directly into my blood, which instantly reached my brain. Now, all the masked and gowned doctors and nurses didn't look human at all anymore. They looked like monsters, demons, even sick, twisted, perverse creatures to whom my mother had sold my soul, and now they were trying to forcibly extract my soul from my body with that terrible needle. I looked at my mother with bitter contempt and screamed that I hated her for doing this to me. That only made her cry more. No matter how much I fought, once they all held me down, I couldn't squirm anymore. They held me tight and finished the lumbar puncture. As the needle poked into my back, it felt as if I were being torn apart from the inside, and because I moved so much, waves of pain shot through my body. Finally, I accepted that I just had to lie still, but it was terrible. I could feel my essence being drained, something I would never get back. Luckily, it was over after a few seconds, but I was no longer the same. I didn't move for hours and didn't speak to my mother or even look at her. Being sedated with a drug and having a needle planted in my back as a child is by far the most traumatic thing I have experienced in my life. And the stupidest part is that it was all done just to confirm what the doctors basically already knew, that I had spinal meningitis. Next true horror story. When I was a teenager, there was an old abandoned hospital that had been built in the 19th century. It had long since been replaced and left to decay. The building couldn't be demolished as it was a historical monument, but it couldn't be reused either, since it fell into disrepair. No one had volunteered to take care of the place, and security was virtually non-existent. So it had become a sort of initiation in my neighborhood to climb the fence on Halloween and explore the ruins. Finally, the moment came when my friends and I decided to be the next ones to do it. We didn't even wear costumes. No one wanted to go trick or treating or to a party. The coolest party in town for me and my friend's was on the roof of the old hospital. All we had to do was find a way up, and avoid the numerous dangers along the way, rumors of which were told by everyone who had ever been there. From broken glass, rusty nails, and homeless people to trapdoors, collapsing ceilings, and even ghosts, allegedly. Understandably, we were all a little nervous, but also excited. It was the coolest thing we had ever done. It seemed as if a whole path was even laid out for us by the people before us. The door at the main entrance was already broken open, so we just walked in. Undeterred, we immediately got to the first floor, which was a triage center. It was so dark that we could barely see far down the corridor with our flashlights. A staircase was right there, and since not much happened on this floor, we decided not to explore the lower area further, and moved on to the second of 3 floors. The ceiling had collapsed at the landing of the second floor, so we went out to look for another staircase. The second floor was somehow even darker. The floor beneath our feet was soft and felt as if it could collapse at any time, so we distributed our weight by spreading out. We thought we were smart by staying quiet. But all we noticed were piles of old medical waste and strange stacks of beds blocking certain doors we didn't even want to enter. We commented on signs indicating what the different rooms had been and imagined what the place might have looked like in its prime. Yet what we found was anything but that. When we arrived, mold was growing on the walls, vines snaked through the ceiling tiles, and water dripped from the 3rd floor. Every sound we made echoed so much that it felt as if a stranger was whispering around every corner. We kept talking about how cool everything was, but deep down, I think we were all a bit scared. The last thing any of us wanted was for a crazy homeless person to suddenly jump out of hiding to punish us for invading his home, or for one of the many ghost stories about the allegedly haunted hospital to turn out true. Even decades after it closed, even naive and carefree boys like us could feel the lingering sense of suffering and cursed souls who had died in the place we were currently entering. The only living things that seemed to live there were rats and flies, but not as many as we had expected. After a few more minutes of looking around, we finally reached the other side of the building and found another staircase. This led us straight up to the roof. As we stepped into the damp concrete nest, we could feel the outside air and hear it blowing through an open door or hatch. Whatever it was, we were eager to find out. We quickened our pace and ran up the stairs, eager to see the view, barely noticing the moss growing on the steps, slowing the grip of our shoes. Finally, at the top of the stairs, there it was, the open door at the landing. We paused briefly to take a mental picture of this sight. Luckily, the moon seemed to shine right through that door, and if one of us had had a camera, it would have been a legendary photo. After all, it was just a moment of appreciation before we wanted to end our journey. Of the 4 of us, I was the last in line as we went up the stairs, and a friend of mine led the group. We were only seconds away, but then the last thing we expected happened. Out of nowhere, a swarm of bats exploded from a nest we hadn't seen. My friend at the top was startled, slipped on the moss, and fell backward, triggering a chain reaction that knocked us all over like dominoes. 3 of my friends landed on me, and my head crashed directly onto the concrete. That is the last thing I remember before waking up in a real hospital. I had cracked my head open, fractured my skull, and my friends had to carry me out of that abandoned ruin and get help. They had to tell me 100 times before I could finally accept that exactly that had happened. Unfortunately, it seemed that none of us made it to the roof of the abandoned hospital, as we had hoped that evening. But I am glad I had such good friends who helped me when I needed them. To this day, many people don't believe that exactly that happened to me, and why I fell. They say bats don't stay in their nests at night, but I guess even nocturnal flying mammals fall asleep sometimes. I am no expert, it's just what I saw. Next true horror story. I work in healthcare sales, so I spend a lot of time in hospitals speaking with doctors and nurses. My job is to explain how our product works, answer their questions, and show them how it can help their patients. I visit different departments and meet with various medical teams to ensure they understand everything about the product. Today, I had no product training or sales calls planned, so I decided to visit a hospital I had never been to, located a few towns away from where I live. I thought it would be a good opportunity to introduce myself, so I brought a box of coffee and some pastries for the doctors, nurses, and staff, hoping it would help break the ice and get them to talk to me. My goal was to make a good impression and hopefully set up a meeting to discuss our product in more detail. I moved to a new place for this job, so I enjoy visiting different hospitals and getting to know my new city while I work. I had never been to this area, but the hospital caught my eye immediately when I saw it in the distance. The building was huge, had a modern design, and looked immaculate. The gardens around the hospital were well maintained with neatly trimmed grass and flowers. The parking lot was completely full, which showed how busy the place was. I was lucky and found a parking spot near the entrance. I got out of my car with the coffee and goodies and walked toward the entrance doors. They were locked, so I had to be buzzed in. That was pretty normal since the pandemic started. A sign asked me to state the name of the doctor or patient I was visiting. When I pressed the buzzer, the front sliding doors opened, and I stepped inside. The lobby was empty, completely deserted. Old, worn-out wheelchairs were scattered around. Some were tipped over in strange positions. I saw no staff or visitors, which made the place seem even more abandoned. It was a huge hospital in a busy city, but not a single person sat in the waiting area, and the decor looked very old and didn't match the impressive exterior of the building. The waiting chairs had faded designs and looked as if they hadn't been used in years. The carpet was dirty and stained, and the glass doors to the adjoining rooms were cloudy and unclean. Somewhat surprised, I went to the reception desk, but no one was there, and it looked like no one had been there for a long time. The entire area where someone would normally sit was empty. There wasn't even a pen, a pad, or a cup of coffee in sight. It felt odd to see such an empty space in a hospital. On the desk stood a rotary phone. Yes, a real rotary phone. I am 28 and honestly, that was the first time I had to use one. The phone had a dusty surface as if it hadn't been touched in ages. Taped to it was a handwritten note that read, DL0 for the operator. The note looked old and worn, reinforcing the feeling that this place had been forgotten. I picked up the phone, but there was no dial tone. I hung up and tried again, but it was completely dead. At this point, I was really scared, but I was still determined to hand over the coffee and my business cards to the right people. I turned around and saw that I was still all alone in this place. There were no patients or staff in sight, and I couldn't even hear distant voices or the usual sounds of a busy hospital. I placed the coffee and food on the reception desk and began looking around and scanning the hallways. The left side was completely dark, making it hard to see anything, and it looked as if the light bulb had burned out. I still saw no one. No doctors, no patients, and no nurses. That's when I started to feel a bit uncomfortable. The silence became louder, and the strange feeling I had upon entering intensified. The empty chairs in the waiting area only added to the weirdness. My whole job revolves around spending time in such places, so I know how busy hospitals usually are. But this felt completely different. So I went back to the lobby and took the things I had brought. As I left, I counted 7 wheelchairs in the lobby, arranged as if they had been left behind in a hurry. When I stepped back through the entrance doors into the parking garage, a feeling of relief washed over me. The strange feeling was gone, and I was a bit disappointed that I hadn't met my potential future clients. I drove around the building to see if there was another entrance I should have used, and if maybe this one was currently being renovated. But I saw nothing else. The only other door was a back door that looked closed and uninviting. So, frustrated, I decided to call my colleague from whom I had taken over the territory to ask if they had ever been to this facility. I thought they might give me some advice, or at least tell me if they had experienced anything strange there. They said they had been there several times, and the waiting area looked nothing like I had described it. Next true horror story. My father is just finishing his final days of treatment at a state hospital, so I visited him for Father's Day. He has been in a facility in Jamestown, North Dakota, for several months. The building has a long history, which makes it a bit interesting. During my visit, we started talking about spooky things and his experiences there. He told me some strange stories about things he has seen and heard while in the facility. The hospital opened in 1885 and was initially a place for people with mental illnesses and those who had committed crimes. It was built to help the needy, but within a few years, it struggled with a serious overcrowding problem. The number of patients was constantly rising, so the hospital had to be expanded many times to accommodate everyone. But unfortunately, it still didn't have enough staff to properly care for all the patients. In 1937, the situation became even more complicated. So the governor decided to fire the hospital director responsible for the facility, along with 75% of the staff. They were replaced by new people, many of whom were hired based on their political donations rather than their experience. After the governor fired most of the staff, the new workers weren't qualified to care for the patients. They treated the patients very poorly. In 1949, the situation became public when newspapers reported on the overcrowding and neglect at the hospital. They highlighted the issue of malnutrition, where many patients didn't get enough to eat. In 1953, a reform began when the government and hospital authorities recognized the need for change. New guidelines were introduced to improve care, hire qualified staff, and ensure the safety and well-being of the patients. As a result, things at the hospital began to improve, and the patients received the care they needed. By 1970, the number of patients had been reduced from more than 2,000 in the 1940s to about 600, and today there are only around 200 patients left. My father liked to stay busy there, so he kept taking on various tasks, be it activities for the patients, assisting the staff, or volunteering for different programs. As far as I understand, the hospital was like a partner institution to his rehabilitation center. But the people there were treated more like prisoners, while he had more freedom and could leave when he wanted. He went into the part of the hospital that looks like a prison today and helped one of the ladies who worked there with the laundry. They folded many sheets and towels, and then went downstairs for a while to get something. When they came back, they found the sheets thrown on the floor and completely messy, which surprised them. It is important to mention that in this area, everything is kept locked so no one could get in to cause the mess. The lady who worked there told my father that it was Charlie, the ghost said to haunt this part of the prison. The lady told my father that they had names for different ghosts, because there were so many of them. They even have some rooms that they have blocked off, because whenever a resident or inmate moved into those rooms, they refused to stay there because so many creepy things happened. Even the old warden's office was so haunted by ghosts that he told the staff if they didn't find him a new room for his things, he would quit his job and leave. My father said strange things happened there, such as objects moving by themselves or even flying off shelves, which scared everyone. Since my father could often leave the facility and had a job outside, he and a few other people decided to take a local job for lawn work. They were responsible for maintaining the grounds around the hospital and the nearby cemetery. One day, as he was working with a small group of people in the middle of the afternoon, the area of the hospital grounds they were working on was no longer in use. But the building they were near had many windows, so you could see everything inside. Then, he and another man saw someone moving inside the building, so they told their boss that someone else was working there. My father and the other man found it strange to see someone in a place that had been empty for years. But their boss laughed it off, joked that they had seen a ghost, and thought it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. My father is a very pragmatic person, but he and the others saw the figure clearly enough to notice his clothing and everything else. "Did you see what he was wearing?" the other man asked my father with a fearful voice. "Yes," replied my father. "Someone is playing a prank on us." That was a person. Then they saw the figure again. My father said the same ghostly figure walked quickly down the hallway in their direction. They could still see through the window and saw him turn the corner into the garage. He wore an old-fashioned black and white suit with a matching hat and kept his head down, as if trying to hide his face from them. The man with my father ran away and said he was done working there because he was so scared. But my father yelled at him to run to the front so they could catch the person trying to scare them. They checked all possible doors, but no one was there. Somehow the boss got the keys so they could investigate that part of the building. My father said it was so dusty inside that they could see their footprints on the floor. There was no trace of the man they had seen. "The guy must have been doing something shady," said my father, because he kept ducking away from us and trying to hide his face. Next true horror story. I work as a night shift security guard at a large hospital, and my job brings me into contact with all sorts of strange situations. My experiences can range from normal to moments that are harder to explain. I haven't seen or heard anything unusual for many weeks, but then there are periods when the activities around me increase and things seem much more intense. Lately, the activities seem to occur more frequently and are becoming clearer and harder to ignore. I don't know if it's just in my head or if something is really going on. It could be nothing, or it could be something. I guess it could go either way. My shift started like any other night. On the weekend, there was a patient in the hospital, but he was discharged shortly after 1600 p.m. By 700 p.m., all the nurses had clocked out, so I was the only one left in the building. It's pretty quiet here at night. I am also a student, so I sat at my desk and did some homework to pass the time. Around 8:30 p.m., my phone rang. Usually, when it rings, no one is on the other end. The calls are always silent. But this time was different. When I picked up the phone, I heard static, but through the static, I could make out a woman's voice. I answered as I normally would, expecting the usual silence. But hearing the voice was unexpected and confused me. The voice was faint, but I could tell it was there. The woman said she was locked in the waiting room and couldn't get out. This happens sometimes with the cleaning staff, because the doors to the waiting room close automatically when someone enters. There are 2 waiting rooms in the hospital. One where I usually work, which is close to my desk, and another at the opposite end of the building. Concerned, I grabbed my keys and hurried off to let her out. But when I reached the waiting room, it was empty, and there was no trace of her. I went back to my desk, sat down, and tried to concentrate on my schoolwork. I didn't think it was worth returning the call, since I hadn't seen anyone, and it is hard to miss someone in the waiting room. Then, about 30 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was the same voice as before, and she said she was still stuck in the waiting room. I felt a mixture of concern and confusion, so I asked her where exactly she was located. I wanted to understand why she hadn't come out yet, and how she could still be locked in. She said she was in the waiting room by the parking lot, which was one of the 2 waiting rooms. So I went back to check again. But again I saw no one. I turned around and glanced at the security monitor for that room. The screen showed nothing but a still image. Nothing moved to trigger the camera. In fact, I received another call about 15 to 20 minutes later. This time they asked why I hadn't let them out of the waiting room yet. They spoke through the static, and the woman on the other end said she was just visiting her son. I am not sure why it didn't occur to me earlier, but we had no more patients after about 6:00 p.m. The only patient we still had who was discharged was an elderly woman, and I realized this woman didn't fit that description at all. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about what that could mean. Frustrated, I said, "Look, lady, there are 2 waiting rooms you could be in. I am in one of them, and you aren't in the other." After I said that, I heard a slight giggle, and then the phone went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I checked the call history and tried to call back all the numbers, but they were all inactive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on, and I couldn't understand who or what I had really spoken to. I know there are phone apps that can clone numbers, so I don't rule out that this was a prank by someone trying to trick me. I can't say if what happened was paranormal or not, but if it was, it didn't seem like any of the phenomena. I know. I am a skeptic myself and always try to consider other possibilities. Nevertheless, this situation is put on the list of things I am not entirely sure about. Next true horror story. I have worked as a nurse in several hospitals and facilities. Before the hospital, where I am currently employed, I worked in a geriatric hospital located 30 minutes from my house. I had experience with elderly patients, so that was nothing new to me. I had only been working there for a few weeks, and soon you will understand why that was. This happened during my penultimate shift at that hospital. At the beginning of the night, I had no idea what was coming my way. I was working the night shift and had gotten little sleep. I had been assigned to the Alzheimer's ward, and the patients on the ward liked me very much. As a young woman in my 20s, I was probably a refreshing change for these elderly residents who were often trapped in their own thoughts. My presence helped them stay in the here and now and gave them a sense of connection. That evening, I was taking care of several patients, but one stood out in particular, Lena. It was my first night taking care of her, and she kept telling me about voices she heard, and a man in black standing in the corner of her room. The other woman in the room had asked to keep her curtain closed, likely to avoid Lena's chatter. This woman was lovely, always smiled when I was around, but she was forgetful and didn't speak much. Around 11:00 p.m., most of the patients were asleep, except for Lena. Every time I entered her room, she was frightened and claimed the man in black was staring at her. Her fear began to unsettle me. I truly believed her that these things in her head were real. I sympathized with her and imagined how frightening that must be. Still, I did my best to calm her down and help her fall asleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV so as not to disturb her roommate. Instead, I held Lena's hands, calmed her, and told her to take deep breaths. I reminded her that she wasn't alone, and that I was just a button press away. That seemed to calm her, and at the next check, she was asleep. As most patients slept, the night grew quieter. Time seemed to run backward. About an hour or two later, I was in the linen storage room organizing my cart when I heard a sound. It was strange because the room was small and quiet, and I had closed the door. I looked around and saw nothing. Then I felt something like a hand on my shoulder. I looked down, jumped up, and screamed, but there was nothing there. No one was in the room with me. Yet I knew I had felt something. My heart raced as I peered into the hallway. It was perfectly silent, and no other nurses were nearby. I had no choice but to continue loading my cart. As I turned to the door, my heart almost stopped. There, through the glass, stood a man in black, smiling at me. I fell to the floor and screamed. The man disappeared, and seconds later the door opened. One of my colleagues came in, worried. She helped me up while I asked her, "Did you see the man in black?" She looked at me confused and said, "What man? No one is here." We searched the entire ward but found no one dressed in black. My screams had woken Lena, who was now talking about the voices again. She didn't know the screams came from me. I asked her if the man in black had smiled, and her expression turned serious. "How do you know that?" she asked. Even with my racing heart, it skipped a beat at her words. Then she began to scream, "Get me out of here! He is coming!" The other nurses rushed in to calm her down. I was transferred to another ward that night and went home early because I was so shaken. The next day, I wrote a message to the head nurse explaining that my next shift would be my last. I explained that the experience had traumatized me, and I couldn't work in that building anymore. I received a kind reply understanding my decision. I have never been diagnosed with mental illness and never experienced hallucinations. I am aware of the effects of sleep deprivation, but this went beyond that. I don't know if my mind played tricks on me because of all the things Lena had said all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder and the sight of the smiling man through the glass, exactly the description Lena had given, were simply too real. That was one of those unexplained supernatural experiences. At least I hope it was a one-time experience. Next true horror story. 3 years ago, I fell ill with bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't think there was an outbreak or anything like that at the time, so I don't know how I got infected or who I could have gotten it from. I began to develop very bad symptoms, severe headaches, confusion, drowsiness, nausea, and loss of appetite. But when the hallucinations kicked in, I knew it was something really serious. While I lay sick in bed and my husband was at work, I heard the voice of a child crying, "Mommy," from downstairs. "We don't have children." I dragged myself out of bed, looked down the stairs, and called my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I got from standing up was too strong, so I went back to bed. The second time I heard a voice calling from downstairs. It said, "Hello." I picked up the phone and called my husband. I was completely distraught and told him I heard a creepy child's voice in the house and thought I was hallucinating. He heard how desperate I was and left work early to take me to the hospital. While I waited for his return, I changed out of my pajamas. During that, I suddenly had to run to the bathroom to vomit. As I was in the middle of vomiting, I heard another voice from outside the bathroom. I couldn't understand what it said, and I didn't know if it sounded like the other voice. I felt like I was losing my mind. I was only diagnosed at the hospital, and apparently, my illness, if left untreated, could have been very serious, even fatal. The doctor explained to me that hallucinations are unusual, but not unheard of in cases like mine. Shortly after arriving at the hospital, I was given antibiotics via NIV. The doctor told me I was very lucky to have come to the hospital so quickly, because if I had waited longer, the disease could have had permanent consequences or been fatal. My husband stayed in the room with me for a few hours. I was told I had to stay in the hospital for a few days to a week due to the severity of my symptoms. Around 10:00 p.m., my husband went home because he had to work the next day. The nurse told me to call her if I had any problems. Although I still felt terrible, I fell asleep pretty quickly. That's when I had this strange dream where my ex-husband stood in the room, leaned over my bed, and spoke to me. He said terrible things about my current husband. He patted my head, said he was glad I was okay, and that he had come as soon as he saw my husband had left. Then he began a tirade about how much he hated my current husband and wanted to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead and then left the room. I often have nightmares about my ex-husband because our marriage was so toxic and abusive, which was also the reason it ended. I prefer not to go into detail about that. I woke up in a drowsy, dizzy state and looked around the room. A chair stood in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting on it. The chair hadn't been there when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I fell back asleep. The next morning, the nurse came into the room. I told her about the strangely vivid dream I had, and she frowned. She said, "That wasn't a dream. Your cousin David visited you last night." I told her that I don't have any cousins living in this state. She looked more serious now and said, "Well, someone who said he was your cousin David visited you late last night." David was my ex-husband's name. After I explained that to her, the nurse fetched a doctor. The doctor told me that the antibiotics might have triggered delirium, impairing my ability to distinguish sleep from wakefulness. He said that explained why I had heard so vividly what David had said. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and naturally, he was furious and worried. He visited me again that evening after returning from work. That day, I texted David asking him what he was thinking visiting me and how he knew I was in the hospital. My message was delivered, but he ignored it. I sent another message telling him I had heard all his threats against my husband and would involve the police. Minutes later, he replied, "I didn't make any threats against your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. You must have heard something in your sleep." I replied, "Stay out of my life, or I'm calling the police." After that, he didn't reply anymore. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my half-sleep, because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of antibiotics and my already strange auditory hallucinations the day before, I didn't think it was possible that what I heard hadn't actually been said. But I could also be wrong. I was discharged from the hospital the next week. Next true horror story. This happened in 2012. I was working as a construction worker, and we were renovating an old hospital that had been closed for some time. The building was erected in the 1950s, and from what we had heard, it was closed in the early 2000s due to a combination of funding issues and outdated facilities. Our job was to convert the building into a new medical office. The job was pretty standard, but it started getting creepy as soon as we entered the hospital for the first time. The place was dilapidated. It felt as if people had left it in a hurry. Old beds still stood in the rooms, medical equipment lay around, and even patient files were still on desks. The air was thick with dust, and everything smelled of must and decay. The first few weeks went smoothly. The team tore down walls, removed old fixtures, and prepared the building for renovation. But then strange things began to happen. One night, I was asked to stay longer to supervise the unloading of new equipment. It was already past 700 p.m., and everyone else had gone home for the day. I was alone in this huge, dark hospital with only a flashlight and a portable radio for company. The power had been cut for the renovation, so I had to rely on a small generator to keep some of the work lights on. As I walked down one of the long corridors, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it might be an echo of my own steps, but when I stopped, the footsteps continued for a few seconds before they also stopped. I turned around and shone my flashlight down the hall, but there was nothing. Only darkness. I shrugged and continued my inspection, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. A few minutes later, I was in one of the old patient rooms checking if the floor was safe when I heard a soft voice. It was so quiet that I first thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, this time clearer. It was a woman's voice whispering my name. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around the room and shone the light into every corner, but no one was there. The voice came again, this time louder, as if right next to me. Help me. I ran out of that room without caring what I left behind. I ran down the hall, past the rooms we hadn't touched yet, and made my way to the main entrance. The footsteps followed me all the way, but I didn't turn around a single time. When I reached the entrance, I was panting and sweating, even though it was the middle of winter. I quickly locked up and waited outside until the delivery truck with the equipment arrived. I didn't tell the driver what happened. I didn't want to seem crazy. The next day, I told one of the other workers what had happened. He gave me a strange look and then said, "You aren't the first one this has happened to." Apparently, several of the other workers had heard voices and seen strange shadows moving in the building, especially in the area where the old morgue used to be. Some even claimed to have seen figures in hospital gowns wandering the halls late at night. The final straw came about a week later. I was working late again, but this time I wasn't alone. Another colleague was there, and we were both finishing some work in one of the patient rooms. We were just packing our things for the night when we heard a loud bang from the hallway. It sounded as if something heavy had fallen over. We both grabbed our flashlights and went to check, assuming maybe one of the devices had tipped over. When we got to the spot of the noise, we found a complete metal shelf that had toppled over. The strange thing was that the shelf had been screwed to the wall just a few days ago, and it took a lot of force to knock it over. There were no signs that anyone else was in the building, and all doors were locked from the inside. We quickly cleaned up the mess and left the building as fast as possible. After that incident, I refused to work alone in that hospital. I told my boss he could find someone else if he needed someone for night watch. Luckily, the job was completed a few weeks later, and I haven't set foot in that building since. I still wonder what I heard and saw that night. Was it just my imagination, or was there something more sinister in that old hospital?